Good morning and welcome to our series where we're looking at the women in the lineage of Jesus. This morning it's the story of Ruth. There's 4 chapters of it, so do read the story. Again, if you've got an opportunity to read Francine Rivers' Lineage of Grace, she really fleshes out the story and the human aspect of it, and that's great. And what I'm going to do this morning is I'm just going to pick out 2 things that I think are really impressive in Ruth and that help us understand, in a sense, very different from the wandering away and the returning that we see in Naomi. But actually, Ruth for us can be an example of what does good discipleship look like. And so I'm going to look at 2 things: her steadfastness and her faith and trust in God's provision for her. So firstly, her steadfastness. In chapter 1, we see her steadfastness through her experience of grief. It must have been really difficult for her to lose her children, and particularly the loss of the husband, and also the fact that they were childless at that time means that in that culture where women had no independent means, that actually she would be provided for either by her husband or by her children, as she was no longer able to look after herself. And of course, therefore, to have none of those means that she would have been expected to live her life out in poverty. Naomi refers to it at one stage. She's not able, as was the custom at the time, to have other children to enable her to marry those children. So she, in a sense, is destitute. She has no future. She has no present. And obviously she has lost her respect. She has lost of the community. She's lost also the intimacy of her relationship with her husband. But also we see in chapter 1 that she makes a decision that she is going to stick with Naomi, and therefore she's going to become a migrant, a refugee. And therefore her grief encompasses leaving behind her homeland and also her family. There are many in our own community here at St. Paul's just who know how difficult it is to leave homeland and family behind, and the grief that goes with that, as well as the joy of going somewhere new. But what's interesting is that unlike for Naomi, who you see is bitter through all of this, you get the impression that Ruth is steadfast. She meets it graciously, lovingly, caring. You see that when Naomi goes back, she says, well, actually, I'll come with you. I will look after you. We've been through this grief together. Let me look after you. That's very odd, because actually her best hope in that culture was for her to return to her own family. And if she returned to her own family, she would have the opportunity perhaps of marrying somebody who was a widower or somebody who was older who would like another wife, who might then give her children and her means to be looked after in her old age. But actually, she is loyal, she is steadfast, she sticks with Naomi. But more than that, do you see that she says, I will go with you and your God will be my God? She is faithful. There is a glimmer of her faith here, that she knows and trusts in God and his steadfastness to his people. We don't know what was the practice of Naomi and her children and their households. Did they stay faithful to Yahweh, their covenant God? Did they get involved in the religions of the local people? Such was their keenness to fit in? We don't know. But there is something clearly about the example of Naomi that has made Ruth willing to be steadfast in her commitment and loyalty to her, despite her grief, despite the fact that the better opportunities were to be like Orpah, the other daughter-in-law, did, which was to leave Naomi and let her go. We see her steadfastness in another situation too, in chapter 2. She's arrived in a different culture. They spoke similar but not identical languages, but she clearly would have been able to make herself understood. But some of the promises, some of the practices of Israel would have been very different. And Ruth, in her bitterness and in her depression, doesn't really want to do anything. So she says to Ruth, go out and glean. It would have been something that was completely unknown to Ruth, but she goes willingly. And what we see there is that she's willing to work hard through the heat of the day to gather in whatever food she could so that Naomi and she could be fed. She obviously knows hunger and poverty. She is not an untypical refugee in that sense. And yet, faithfully and steadfastly, she goes out. Even though Naomi is stuck at home and cannot get beyond, in a sense, her own bitterness and anguish and disappointment. It's not an easy place for her to be good and faithful and steadfast. We see from the instructions of Boaz to his steward, make sure the men don't bother her. I'm sure that wasn't just something that he thought up. He knew the culture of the day. He knew what men were like. And here was this single young woman, and they would have wanted to have taken advantage of that. And yet, even though she was going into somewhere that was risky, she went. What's interesting too is that when Naomi arrives and she says to the women in chapter 2, she says, I have nothing when she arrives. Can you imagine what Ruth must have felt when she heard those words? Naomi is saying, I brought nothing with me. Well, what about Ruth, who is here, who is going out to feed you? And yet Naomi says, I've got nothing. She doesn't even at this moment in time appear to value Ruth. She's just another burden, perhaps, something else to worry about. It could have been crushing, absolutely crushing for Naomi to say those words to Ruth. But she continues. She knows that Naomi's not in a good place. So she carries on despite those words. She carries on going out day by day in the heat of the sun and the hard work, doing what was necessary. And of course, let's not think that in that culture and that day they were any more welcoming or hospitable towards strangers. Not at all. They would have known straight away she was a migrant worker. She was, as the French say, a sans-papier. She was somebody of no status and no worth. So easy to have, in a sense, let that affect who she was and maybe try to live differently or to do things in a different way. But what we see when she goes out gleaning, she understands and she listens and she learns and she is steadfast. And then in chapter 3, we begin to see Ruth beginning to take centre stage as Naomi's planning begins to make a difference. And of course now suddenly Naomi's eyes have been opened at what redemption will do for her and her circumstances. And suddenly she goes into overdrive from despair and discouragement in chapter 2 to suddenly, I've got a great idea, and as the story moves on, she plans all kinds of things for Ruth and Boaz. But actually you think she does ask an awful lot. She sends this young, single, migrant refugee into the men's sleeping area at night. That took some guts, didn't it? To go into a place where actually she was most at risk, where who knows what goes on in these places under cover of darkness. Yet she was faithful and steadfast in that moment. This is what Naomi asked of her. She would listen and do as she was asked. And in that very, very odd and strange setting, and that wonderful, wonderful interplay actually between Boaz and her, when she talks about uncovering the feet to wake him up because he's got cold in the quietness of the night when everyone else is sleeping, and she asks him to literally to put your wing over me. That idea that living under the shadow of God's wing and his protection. And Boaz understands immediately what it is that she is asking. She is saying, would you be my redeemer in so many different ways? But doing it in such a way that she wasn't seen as some kind of harlot coming in to get whatever favours she could at night or anything like that. Not at all. She is trusting and steadfast. And therefore willing to go with all of Naomi's planning for her future and her life, and saying, okay, I will do it. And of course that night leads to the correct order of things. So Boaz goes and does all the necessary things, and ultimately they're married and they have children, and the story goes well. And she's steadfast. It doesn't appear at any point that this was Ruth's plan. This is just Naomi trying to sort something for her. And she stays committed to a plan that she's not had any say in or no control over either. Wonderful, wonderful steadfastness. And secondly, what we see is Ruth's faith in God's provision. I think this is important. It's the kind of the flip side, isn't it, of steadfastness. If steadfastness is just not allowing those circumstances to run you down or to change who you are or to alter your character or anything else, what we see is that that's just could be stoicism. It could just be stiff upper lip. But actually it's based in her faith in God and his good provision for her. It must have been really challenging because for her and her culture, all she could hope for was a husband who would love her, treat her well, look after her, and give her opportunities to be valued and to give her children. Because children were God's blessing, but also they were God's way of ensuring the security of women who were in a culture where they had no economic independence and therefore were always dependent on others. But children were God's provision for her. And yet, even when it seems that what God has given her, a husband and a future, is taken away from her, she doesn't lose that sense of trust. As I mentioned before, we just see that briefly in verse 7. I will go with you and your God and be with his people in his land, following his laws. Maybe this is one of the good points of Naomi that actually we don't see explained in these early chapters. That Naomi in her own household has lived in such a way faithfully before God, even though the decisions to leave and move away from people and land were not hers to have taken. That maybe there is something in Naomi's devotion, in her prayers, that actually means that Ruth has got a glimpse of Yahweh and knows about his love and faithfulness and his open arms for those who return to him, and therefore that this is what has inspired her. But certainly she is doing it without the bitterness that Naomi seems to have. Her faith, in a sense, seems to be stronger, even though it's inarticulate and it's a faith that maybe hasn't even been educated in at all. We also see her faith in God's provision when she embraces the gleaning. I love gleaning and that whole concept. It speaks so much into a corporate culture and actually responsibilities, that if you've got stuff, do you have enough? Can you afford to leave for those who have not? And all those kinds of things about how social justice was lived out amongst God's people. But also what it says is that God will provide even for those who have not. And there's detailed instructions about what happens for families who fall into hardship, who are obliged to sell their land, who are obliged to go into servanthood so that they work for others if they cannot maintain things themselves, and actually how that's for a limited time. And then even in the farming practices, there is ways in which people who have struggled and people who have lost things actually still have a way in which they can receive foods. Of course, they have to work for it. They've got to be willing to go out and work in those fields and then collect the things that others have left behind. It's not given to them. It's not a share of the harvest, no, but it's just provision there to encourage them into work, to enable them to find ways in which God's provision for them can be seen, and also they can continue to trust him. And of course, that's what she does. And as she trusts in that provision, then you see when she encounters Boaz and he gives her grain, you see the abundance actually of that provision. But the abundance of that provision would not have started had she not actually been there, involved in the gleaning and doing the work that was necessary. In a way, God's way of saying, look, I will look after you. If you trust me and let me look after you, then also my people will look after you. It's a wonderful picture. And of course, she's trusting in this, even though this is not her culture, it's not her upbringing, it's not what she would have learned as a child at all. It shows real faith and trust, doesn't it, in God? And the final way in which she shows her faith and trust in God and his provision for her is her future. Of course, we realise as we read through this that Boaz is a real gentleman. He is respectful of her. He ensures that she isn't badly treated by others. He is generous in the sense that he says to those who are working for him, let things fall, so that actually she has extra. We see that he is honouring to her when she comes to him in the night. He doesn't take what is not given. He doesn't demand what she isn't willing to give. He treats her with honour and respect. And actually, when he has everything to lose, when he goes to the city gate and says, I'm not the one actually who should be claiming her land and Naomi's daughter-in-law Ruth. There is another who has a better claim. He trusts in God that provision, if it is right, will come to him, if he is given the opportunity to be redeemer. But we know this, but of course Ruth didn't. And so therefore she is trusting her future and God's provision on this person that she has just met. It's an encouragement, isn't it? That at the most significant moment in her life, as she thinks about what is her children, what is her husband, who will father her children, in conversations and negotiations going on in which she appears to have no say, she is trusting that this is God's good provision for her. And I think I love the little bits that the way in which this story is told, is that at no stage are we ever told anything about Ruth's physical characteristics. Was she strikingly beautiful such that Boaz couldn't take her eyes off her? Well, no, we're not told any of those things. We'll hear about David and Bathsheba next week, and that's a very, very different story. But actually what we see here is that the only thing that is showed to us about Ruth is her character, her faith, her steadfastness, her willingness to care for and look after others, her loyalty. It's this that commends her to Boaz. And therefore, again, we know very little about Boaz, whether he was young or old, whether he had other wives, whether he was a widower. We know nothing other than his character and his godliness. And so what we see is somebody for whom her character and the way she behaves was of prime importance. She trusts her future because that's what she sees also in Boaz. that he will treat her well, that he will love her, he will care for her. It's a great, great story. And of course, we know the outcome of that is that she was that their son will be the grandfather. She is the great-grandmother of King David. And of course, she is also in that line that Jesus is born from. But as we read the story, let's just focus in on those two things: her faithfulness and trust in a God who provides, and just that steadfastness in whatever circumstance.